Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Namaskar friends, welcome again. The master students who are doing this course on literary theory and criticism from Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. This is from the Chaitanya studio of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University. Myself Dilip Barad, Professor and Head Department of English, Maharaja Krishna Kumar Singh Ji, BAOUGujarat University. This is the second talk on preface to lyrical ballads. Okay, so in the paper of literary theory and criticism, here we are going to talk about Wordsworth as a critic. In the first part, we already have dealt with the idea of theme and subject matter of poetry as discussed by William Wordsworth in his famous preface, which was published with Lyrical Ballads first time in 1798, and then in the second edition he added a few more things to refute the charges that were levied upon him by the critics in 1800 and then in 1802 also. So we are referring to the collective arguments which were presented in the subsequent prefaces by William Wordsworth, and how his defense of his experiments that he has carried out along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge in Lyrical Ballads became a new poetic creed. How his defense gave us a kind of a new way of looking at poetry, not only poetry as such, but the new definition of poetry. Not only that, but we also got the subject matter of poetry. Not only the subject matter, but the manner, the style, the diction also is changing here. And he tries to justify everything in a very interesting way, slightly philosophical, but still in a quite interesting way. In this second part, we are going to deal with the theory of poetic diction as propounded by William Wordsworth in the preface of Lyrical Ballads. Well, so let us see how we look at this idea of poetic diction as being discussed by William Wordsworth. Okay, so Wordsworth's reaction against the 18th century poetic diction. So his poetic diction is considered as a sort of a kind of what we call it as a reaction against 18th century poetic diction. So which was about loftiness in writing, which was about more of a city life or a classical tradition of artistically embellished language. Those were the normal tradition of 18th century, and he is reacting against that. So we can say that he obviously will be moving from the lofty diction to simplistic one. Yeah, simplistic way of writing. That is what he will be trying to look at. Okay? He was highly influenced by Rousseau and French Revolution. We have marked this in our first talk also, that he is influenced by Wordsworth came forward in 1798 with a new theory of man. Yes, he came with a new theory of man, a new theory of nature, and a new theory of poetry also, because his poetry is going to deal with man who is as natural as possible, and that natural being he found in the rustic environment. So to present this rustic man in his vivid sensation, he found that maybe we'll have to change the language also. The language of the city, the language of the culture perhaps may not carry the weight of the subject matter of nature. Later on in 20th century, we came across the debate between culture and nature. A slight of foreshadowing can be read in Wordsworth's reaction to the poetic diction when he is looking for a man in his natural vivid sensation, and that man can find best expression only in a different language also, the simplistic language of human being. So his quest for a new man, a new theory of nature led to the new theory of poetry as well. In another edition of Lyrical Ballads published in 1802, he elaborately explained his theory of poetic diction as against highly sophisticated language, as against highly sophisticated language of 18th century. He gave rustic colors to the poetic diction. Wordsworth rightly felt that for the new poetry of the new age, a language was needed, and it also required to have its own language. And what he earnestly felt, he expressed in the preface of Lyrical Ballads. His entire effort in renovating the language of poetry was guided by the feeling that all conventions of pedantry must be discarded in order to evolve the true poetic style, which should not only be simple and unaffected, but should possess the power and truth of feeling. So, as we remarked in part 1 also, that Wordsworth is not trying to do something new just to be different. Sometimes many people experiment with art and the style of art just to be different. But he has his own profound logic also. So what logic comes here, as we have seen in the earlier part also? Here it says that all these conventions of pedantry must be discarded in order to evolve the new poetic style, which should not only be simple and unaffected, but should possess the power and truth of feeling. So somehow that cultured being is expressed in such a way, in such a language, that the truth of feeling, the power of feeling, is somewhere lost in hypocrisy or in just making a show of something. So if one has to have that power and truth of feeling, again we'll have to go back to the soil, back to nature, back to our roots. And so he wanted to avoid the pedantic conventions of writing poetry. So what is his theory of poetic diction? In the advertisement of 1798 edition of Lyrical, Wordsworth and Coleridge state that the poems in the collection were intended as a deliberate experiment in style and subject matter. Wordsworth elaborated on this idea in various preface also, earlier versions also. We have already talked about this in detail in part 1. So we are skipping this part here. In case when you sit down to write your answers or assignments, in each and every answer or other things, you have to repeat some introductory part. So this part is repeated in this video also. Wordsworth explained his poetic concept also in that part. The majority of the poems were to be considered as experiments. They were chiefly written with a view to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. So that was how they were trying to experiment. The people who said that the purpose of poetic pleasures can only be achieved if the language is of different kind. So you want to say, can this middle and the lower classes of people, their language can carry the weight of what is traditionally known as poetic language or poetic diction or poetic emotion, poetic sensibility or not. Okay, let us see. Yeah, so he rejects the classical notion that poetry should be about elevated subjects and should be composed in formal style only. So no need to have a formal style of writing. He's clearly rejecting the classical notion. We know that one of the reasons, one of the way of looking at what is classicism and romanticism is that romanticism do not give as such credit or value or respect to classical notions. So that is what this romanticism is. That also it is romanticism obviously doesn't mean only like love, adventure, other thing, but it is also anti-classical as such. Wordsworth instead championed more democratic themes, the lives of ordinary men and women, farmers, paupers, and the rural people. In the preface, Wordsworth also emphasizes his commitment to writing in the ordinary language of people, not a highly crafted poetic one, not a highly crafted a poetic one. True to traditional ballad form, the poems depict realistic characters in realistic situations, so contain a strong narrative element. He stated, the principal object proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate to describe them throughout as far as this was possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. The language of this man has been adopted because such men communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. This last part is very significant to be seen here. Here, what he says is the language of these men has been adopted because he keeps on giving his justification. Yeah? Because such men communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. So one is rooted into the basic emotions and feelings, and from there, the very new kinds of sensibilities are emerging. Perhaps the cultured poetry, the cultured diction was slightly going away from this genuineness of being a human being. And so he is going back to this diction. The major part of this section is this. Slightly in the previous slides, there were a few repetitions from the part 1 also. But this is the very important or the crux of this second part of our discussion. Three main principles of Wordsworth's poetic diction. Three main principles of Wordsworth's poetic diction. Now let us see what are they. As we examine Wordsworth's statement regarding poetic diction, the following 3 points come to our attention. First one, the language of poetry should be the language really used by men, but it should be a selection of such language. All the words used by the people cannot be employed in poetry. It should be filtered and refined. The refined vernacular words should be the diction of poetry. Okay? So first principle, he says, as we have discussed as a controversial element in part 1 also, the same thing here, but he's very clear about it. He is very clearly and is solving the problem of the controversy there, that the language of poetry should be used by men, but then there should be a selection. The refined the refined vernacular words. What kind of vernacular words? Refined vernacular words should be the diction of the poetry. Again, so language used by men, but not all kinds of the thing. There should be some kinds of filter, some kind of refinement that goes in that, and that becomes the part of the poetry. Second point, it should be the language of man in a state of vivid sensation. It should be the language of man in a state of vivid sensation. It should have a certain coloring of imagination. The poet should give the color of his imagination to the language employed by him in poetic composition. Now here if you see this, the man in a vivid sensation, a man in a state of vivid sensation. We can put this man along with that man which Aristotle said that should be imitated in the writing of tragedy. That was man in action. So that man in action, or let us say that the liveliness of the liveliness of Dryden when he defines play. Now, maybe Wordsworth's man is very similar to the liveliness of Dryden, or let us say the man in action in Aristotle's Poetics also. So, we see that man in a state of vivid sensation, and that experience of that man should be presented with coloring of imagination. It should not be a dull presentation. It should be beautified with the color of imagination. So realism is there. Realistically you have to present, but it should be slightly beautified. It should not remain the brazen world of nature. It should become the golden world of poet, as Sir Philip Sidney used the word. The poet should give the color of his imagination to the language employed by him in poetic composition. Should give color of imagination to the language employed by him in the poetic composition. That is his second very important principle for the poetic diction there. What is the third and the final one here? There is no essential difference between the words used in prose and metrical composition. We'll see there is no essential difference. There is no essential difference between words used in prose and in metrical composition. Metrical composition, here he writes there. Metrical composition. No difference as such. Words of prose and poetry are not clearly discriminated. So the words which be used in prose can find place in poetry and vice versa. What Wordsworth means is that the words in conversation, if they are properly selected, would provide the rough framework of the language of poetry. The language of poetry is heightened by feelings, feeling and emotion. Throughout the power of imagination, the poet can select words fit for poetic composition. When the poet is truly inspired, his imagination will enable him to select from the language really used by men. So the third part, he says that there is no as such a difference between the language of prose or a language of poetry. It depends that how the language of poetry is heightened by the feeling and emotion. By the feeling and emotion. It can be the same word. So many times we say prosaic words are very dull words. Prosaic words are dull words. Poetic words are full of emotions and feelings. Wordsworth says that there is no such difference between metrical composition and prosaic language. Poetic diction, language of poetry is heightened. The same words are heightened by feeling and emotion through the power of imagination. The poet can select words fit for poetic composition from the prose. The same prosaic word can be utilized for the poetic composition also. So in this way, the three points which are given by Wordsworth here, and that is how the theory of poetic diction of Wordsworth tries to say that language of common men should be used, but that language should be refined. There should be selection of the language that has to happen in that, and without that it may be incomplete. As such, there is no difference between language of prose and poetry. The same words which are in prose can be in poetry also, but in poetic composition they are slightly heightened by the poet. And also, now again we will see contradiction keeps on flowing. Coleridge very rightfully in chapter number 14 of Biographia Literaria has identified that the writer of the preface keeps on self-contradicting with himself. So here also he says one thing and then he is like tightening the screw that it should not be that loose, it should not be that simple, it should still have something different from the layman's life and the poetic life, or when one thinks of the language in the poetry, or the vivid sensation of the man which are captured in the feeling. This man also is not any man, it's not any rustic man, but this man also has a specific vivid sensations. So all rustic men may not be having such a vivid sensation. So the men of this poetry, or let us say the rustic characters which are finding space in Wordsworth poetry, are also not all laymen, but those who can have vivid sensations of life. So if that lonely girl that is not a solitary reaper, if she keeps on harvesting and also keeps on singing some folk song, she is enjoying that vivid sensation. She is expressing those vivid sensations. And that perhaps is what Wordsworth meant by the people and the language of the people, the subject matter of the thing, everything, it should be in that way. So as a critic, we can obviously say what Coleridge said is quite right, that there is self-contradiction in Wordsworth, but we can like give a little bit of license to a poet critic, like poetic licenses are given. So to this poet critic also we can give a license, because he has thought something quite significant about the people. Maybe something coming out from French Revolution, the ideas of Rousseau, Voltaire might have played a vital role in trying to see all humanity as one humanity, not the selected few, not only the upper class, but even the downtrodden, the poor farmers, the rustic people, the farm laborers. They also needs to get something in poetic expression also. That is where Wordsworth becomes very significant for us. So that was our second part of the poetry, and the third part, we will deal with poetry, poet, and function of poetry, which is also going to be a very interesting one. So stay tuned with this. This is the end of the second part of dealing. The one more part remains to be dealt in Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. Thank you, everybody.